Hello and welcome to another episode of the Modern Maker Workroom. This is Season 3, Episode 18. In today's episode, we're going to continue with making our doublet, and we're going to create the boned front panels that will help support the abdomen area. So first we take a piece of paper and we'll just trace off a little section of the front, and this will become the pattern for our boning panel. Now we butt the paper right up against the center front edge, right where the cut edge of the hem for the center front is, and then we'll follow the contours around the padding and around the waist seam. Once that's done, then we're going to clean this pattern up just a little bit with rulers, and then we'll move on to actually cutting it out. Now, I don't always use my French curves. I draw a lot of things completely just by eye, but I just wanted to show you this is how I use a French curve when it's time. It just seemed like the right thing to do with this. I wanted a really nice, clean edge. Now, this dotted line that I'm about to draw, I'm not entirely sure what the heck I was thinking when I did it. I may have been thinking that I was going to draw all the bone channels, and then I had stopped and chose a different route. So ignore this dotted line, cut the paper out. I am using this chunk of linen for the pieces. I realized I wasn't cutting on the correct grain, so I refolded it, and then I'm pressing it to give it a nice crisp flatness so that I can draw the pattern shape on. I don't need very much. I'm cutting this out in 4 layers so that I only have to do one set of cuts. This is interior stuff. It doesn't need to be particularly accurate, so there's very little point in trying to trace them off like 2 at a time and trying to be uber precise about it. There's no real need, just because these are, this little sandwich of panels that are sewn together with some bones in them, and then we stitch them in place. It's not meant to be a haute couture part of this process. Once traced out, then I'm just going to ghost. Now I'm going to ghost in the lines of the bones. So I'm going to do 3 little bones. 1, 2, 3. And the size and position of these bones is based on a couple of extant doublets that have a little bit of boning in them. They're usually pretty short, mostly just to keep everything flat in the abdomen area and give a little bit of extra strength to the shape. So I'm cutting all these layers out. Now, you may want to cut 2 at a time if you have dull scissors, but you'll need some very sharp scissors if you're going to cut 4 layers of linen at once. To make the bones, this is again the same synthetic baleen that was in the previous episode, and I'm cutting 2 at a time since there's a right and a left half. So you'll see as I put it on the fabric, I'm leaving a nice big margin, and then I'm using my left thumb to gauge where I'm going to cut it, and then I copy that over for the second piece, and then I'll do it again for the last and tiniest one. Now these bones will get sewn in a very special way in the next segment. It's not like your normal make your bone casings and then shove the bones in. We're going to do it a little bit differently. In order to keep these bones secure for the lifetime of the garment, we don't want these sharp edges on the corners, so I'm just using my scissors to trim away the corners and round the ends a little bit. If we didn't do this, the bones would end up cutting their way through the linen, after a few wearings, and then you'd have them floating around inside your doublet. It wouldn't be particularly convenient. So we want to make sure to round these ends. You can use a file on them too if you want. So we drew the placement and basic length of the bones. Now I'm going to rough in the channels, and these pieces of boning are relatively narrow, so I'm using a 3/8 inch bone channel. 3/8 inch equals roughly 8 millimeters, I think, 8 or 9 millimeters. And I'm just trying to draw the casings so that the little roughed in lines that I did for the bones themselves are centered more or less in the casing. And then I will need to leave a seam allowance at the bottom, so you can see me just ghosting in this allowance so that I mentally have a picture of where the bones need to end. And this is roughly where I cut them, and now I'm double checking. Their bones are right there. It's not hard to double check them. So I'm just having a look, and they look good. So the next thing I'll need to do then is to mirror the bone casings onto the opposite side. And so the easiest way to do that is just to line up the top. I know they all taper down to the very bottom corner, so I'm just going to mark the placement at the top here, mirroring one across to the other, and then I'll use the ruler to draw the lines to make them match. Once they're drawn on and I'm ready to begin stitching, I'm going to thread up a needle with T60 top stitching thread. I've got my thimble handy, and this is just a plain running stitch. So the first thing I'll do is close the bottom. And that's just because as I'm working with the bones, I don't want them slipping out of place or anything. So I just do a little running stitch along the line that I ghosted on the bottom. And that's, 3/8 to 1/2 inch. So you're looking at, you're looking at maybe 9 millimeters, 12 millimeters, something like that for the width of this allowance at the bottom. It does not have to be stupendously accurate. It just has to be close. Again, it's on the inside, and there's no real need to overly fuss about its perfection. As long as it's sturdy, it does its job. So once I'm at the bottom, I'll take a couple of stitches and I'll turn, and then I'll begin stitching up one side of this bone casing. And I'm using a running stitch. It's fast and it's easy to do. But I'm finding it a little fiddly to work with this just in the hand. I think it's just because it's so small. So what I'll do, just to make it easier on me, is I'll pin down the little corner, and that gives me something to pull against as I'm making the stitches. And now you can see that I can take 3 or 4 running stitches at a time, and that speeds up the work and makes it more comfortable. This technique of pinning one edge down or securing one corner is very common when you see professional people hand sewing. Some tailors will pin to their leg. I had one master tailor who would just kind of grip it between his thighs as he was working, and just to secure one corner of it. Although those were bigger pieces. There's also an old Victorian tool called a sewing bird, and it is, or also known as a third hand, and it looks like a little set of scissors with a reverse pressure grip on them, and they are usually chained to a table, and they'll do this same job. Now, with the length of the bone secured, I made a little bar tack so that I know that the bone is secured top to bottom. And now, rather than finishing the casing and shoving the bone in, I'm putting the bone in first, and now I'm making sure that I'm stitching right next to it so that this casing is very tight. And again, I'm securing the edge of the fabric down so that I have something to pull against, because I really need to get this needle smushed up against the side of the bone. It's very important so that the bone doesn't move around. Because it's on the abdomen, the wearer will probably be walking and bending over and carrying things, and because of that, we don't want to give the bone a lot of opportunity to slip around and move. If we do, there's a tendency for the edges of the bone to cut through the stitching or the fabric and work its way out. So the more secure we can make this bone in its casing, the more longevity we give to the garment. As I reach the end of this bone, I am going to put another bar tack across the bottom, again to really just cram that bone into that casing and make sure that it is just tight, tight, tight. It's so important to make this really tight. When you see 18th century corsetry, you see the stays from that time period, you can see that they've made those casings incredibly tight around those little slivers of baleen. And I think it's important that we use the same concept when we're making these little tiny panels. Even though they are not a corset in and of themselves, they still have to deal with the same movement and pressures. And now we just move on to the second and third bones on this panel, and then we'll follow through and do the same thing on the opposite side. Now I've worked my way up the side of this bone. I'm making the end tack now so that I know how long it needs to be. Then the bone is inserted and then sewn the other side. And here is the final stitches of the last bit of the final bone casing. And you can see, even as I'm moving it and holding it here, you can see how tight those bones are in their casing. Like the tightness in and of itself, that tension, is making the whole piece move a lot more stiffly. And that's what we want. Once the bones are in place, then I will take my iron and just give this a nice little press. And this relaxes the curve of the bone a little bit, since these panels probably should stay very flat. Now, the placement is right up against center front. I'm trying to put it exactly where I drew the pattern from. And I will probably move this down slightly so that it's right against the top of the seam allowance for the waist and right against the cut edge of the turned back allowance at center front. And this gives me something to stitch to. I'm using a cross stitch here, or pardon me, I'm using a catch stitch here so that I know that I'm catching both layers, but there's no reason for me to go all the way through. I don't need any extra stitches on the outside, but using a catch stitch in this way helps secure the edges together and pull them against each other without overly nailing them in place, causing distortion on the outer layers. This is sort of, how do I describe it? It allows it to float in place. Once the center front is done, then I will loosely use this catch stitch along the bottom to allow this to flex just a little bit. And the reason I give the flex is because this is the waist. It is likely being pulled the tightest against the body, and we don't want to be pulling at center front with our lacings and causing problems with the way the front of the skirt hangs, because this is attached to the seam allowance. So I make these stitches slightly larger and looser just to give a little bit more flex in the panel as it's worn. Again, with the concept that it's just kind of floating in place right in the corner between those two sets of allowances, center front and waist. Once this is done, then I get to do the hard part of working my way up the side. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm being extremely careful that I am only catching the interlining on the body. I absolutely do not want these stitches to penetrate through to the outer layer of fabric. So I'm being extremely careful to only catch the linen interlining. Again, just more catch stitches all the way around it. And then once that's done, then we're going to work across the top. I'm just finishing up a little tack basting to hold the top in place. I've kind of pulled this whole panel taut into the little corner where it sits, and then I'm going to thread up my needle with some T60, and I'm going to cross stitch the top. Now these stitches for our cross stitch along the top are going to be very small and very firm. This is the place where we want to give the extra security, but at the same time we have to be very careful that we're not penetrating through to the outside. We are allowing this corset panel to just float in place, but we need it to be nice and secure and to not move too much. So you can see that I'm taking a pretty big bite into the panel itself, but very, very small pick into the linen above where I'm stitching, into the linen canvas of the body. And I'll do this all the way across the top. And once it's done, then the panel is in, and then you repeat with the opposite side, and then that will be the end of this episode. And then on our next episode, we'll move into putting the body lining in place and closing the shoulders. So exciting that we're almost done. With the cross stitching complete, our final step in this episode is to just remove our temporary basting and take it out. Now I'm going to flip this over and you'll be able to see just how nice that looks on the outside. You can't even tell there's a boned panel in there, but you can see how stiff and crisp it is. Thank you so much. Please follow us on Instagram at mnagydesign, visit the website at themodernmaker.co, or join us on Patreon at the $25 a month tier. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time. As always, happy stitching.